I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video. I realize that I have not continued the 16 type series, and the reason for doing so is because I have not had enough time to be as thoughtful and considerative and able to jump into the research of different cognitive factors and traits that are very much relevant to my thought on the other types, particularly the SJs and the SPs, as there, to me, is not a great deal of literature that is empirically based within the MBTI community, and the type of logic I would like to ascribe to them, it needs a great time of maturation and gestation, and so I'm delaying this process because I want those videos to be as accurate and insightful as they possibly can be, and in each type video giving the basis for their existence and the overall way their cognitive schematization can tell us something more about what it means to be human and to exist, and the nature of cognition and phenomenology across the human landscape. So that's a great order, and I'm not going to rush into it. So that is why I'm delaying these videos and talking about things that my mind has had a great deal of time to gestate on, videos I thought about doing before I undertook the 16 type series. So it's not to say that I've forgotten, but that there is a great deal of work going on behind the scenes. And as an introverted type, most people do not see the work in the interlay of networks of processes that go on behind the scenes that lead to something. And I'm just sharing with you that I'm undergoing that process, and I'm within that time. So just give it some time, and the videos will come. And I hope that they don't disappoint. Now, to say in this video, it is something I have talked about in previous videos, but it has been a topic that I have gotten almost just as much disdain and contention with, almost as much as the few comments I made on Christianity or the videos I've made on secular humanism, atheism, and the differences in being secularly based in my thoughts, and so forth. And so this topic would be on multiple intelligences, and it's not specifically on intelligence. Any video I have made on intelligence that did not mention multiple intelligence theory has not gotten any sort of criticism or extreme chide and disdain. Sort of the very knee-jerk whiplash response that comes from so many people, because multiple intelligences is so pleasing to one's practical lay experience and intuitive notions of their own experiences, in so far as being apt to take great information in greater in some domains than others, and having being taught by way of their own individual needs insofar as their deficiencies or their strengths, in terms of a very individuated learning style per se, that many different factors that are not related to intelligence as a scientific theory are brought in and conflated with this issue, that creates a very strong barrier and fog around the issue that not only makes it opaque, but fairly sensitive and volatile if stirred the wrong way, because very really we are talking about people's cognitive abilities, and there is a tendency in egalitarianism to essentially equate people as being the same fundamentally, and I think that this is true, but I do not think necessarily that equality and equal ability are synonymous. They're not the same things. So the fact that having differing abilities can produce the real phenomenon of irreconcilable differences between people greatly disturbs and worries people, and I do think that there is a bias in people insofar as not ever wanting to damn their own ability or existence per se. People do not necessarily like to accept that they're limited in the first place, and anything that would say to make some sort of scale or hierarchical model, even if it is, because there has been in times in history where that has gone severely wrong. We are extremely skeptical of such things and suspicious, and we do not like to hold ourselves in our abilities within doubt, which is, I think, apart from whatever lack of individual treatment of learning programs there is, that truly a human tendency to not like to be exposed to one's weaknesses and deficiencies or shortcomings and limitations is a very strong retardant force within the field of education, I think. The fact that people do not like to be humiliated, the fact that people do not like negative things coming at them per se by way of social forces and whatnot, very real evolutionary baggage that exists in the human psyche. I think that that has a lot to do with the tenderness of this topic. And I said in a video I made in Intelligence before, this will be specifically on multiple intelligences and be another critique on why I do not accept the theory as a scientific theory. But what I said in that video before, in my video on intelligence part 1, is that the merit for a valid scientific theory is its ability to predict things. It is its predictive ability and explanatory scope insofar as simplifying our vision of reality and unifying things so that there doesn't need to be a significant amount of moving parts by way of the mental tool of Occam's razor, which is very fundamental within the scientific mode of thought, that substantiates something's validity as a theory. It should be able to explain a great deal without much moving pieces to it, and it should have a great deal of predictive power in multiple vantage points, and it should have that in terms of intelligence, because we are saying in our conception of intelligence that intelligence is a very underlying pervading factor that exists throughout one's entire being per se, and the way that they orientate themselves in the environment. So it should show up on multiple levels of resolution and comparison and evaluation, even though there is a tendency that I greatly dislike for intelligence to be heavily contextualized within academia and only thought of in an academic and educational background, really, by many. So it's to move on from this and say that on the onset, that one thing people have to understand about intelligence is that there are generally two approaches to the measurement, because I'm only going to deal with what can be measured. That there is the trait conception and there is the ability conception of intelligence. The conception of intelligence as a trait and the conception of intelligence as an ability. And roughly, the theory of Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences falls into the dichotomy of traits, to where the traditional idea of general intelligence falls under the dichotomy of ability. One, it gets its metrics and its quantification, if you really want to call it that, from self-reporting questionnaires, because there is a tendency that researchers have observed in people to have fairly accurate Tacitus evaluations of their own cognitive abilities. People can roughly tell you what their IQ is, and surprisingly, these things do tend to correlate very, strongly with whatever they get on a IQ test. And it's this notion that trait-based questionnaires are based on, though one may have their reservations about questionnaires, how honest people are and whatnot on them. That is the way that this one camp, or this one dichotomy of evaluation is established, to where traditionally within the ability dichotomy, it is diagnostics and batteries, that people are given tests, and they have very real right or wrong elements to them, these questions, and they taken by way of being correct or being in error, sifts one into a statistical category for whatever abilities that test loads and selects for. So the thing I would like to say firstly is that Howard Gardner's theory has been tested within the field of cognitive science, neuroscience, and psychology. There has been research primarily looking for the theory of multiple intelligences within the brain, and what people find is that there is a yes or no sort of thing, and a paradox of did the chicken come before the egg sort of situation. And it is this, that the brain does specialize itself, but it is also equiptional insofar as that there is no one localized region of the brain that does any one thing per se, but it is more like a symphony and an orchestra with rather prominent players in certain regions of the brain carrying a majority of the load, but these other supporting regions that are not necessarily localized within the same sphere, helping to produce said phenomena that the person is doing. So it's to say this, that when researchers go into the brain to try and specifically look for kinesthetic bodily intelligence, musical intelligence, or mathematical logical intelligence, or verbal linguistic intelligence, there is no one spot that they can find it, per se. There is a tendency for when people do a globalized scan and search for the general mechanisms where musical ability arises from, or what we would consider musical abilities, that there is a positive correlation with the idea and the thought that intelligences, that certain abilities that we see people perform cannot be localized per se to any one specific region of the brain. That the brain does, and people do process information differently, and it's this, that information has its own different flavors necessarily. That there's different regions and different centers of the brain that process different types of information, and that not all information is equal or the same. And I think that obviously is the case. I think that has always obviously been the case, but that's not really the problem that anyone should have with multiple intelligences, insofar as that that information comes in many different modalities, and people, given whatever embodied traits that they do have a tendency to process certain types of information better than other types of information. There is no such thing, at least there is no empirical evidence to substantiate the claim that there are really such things as learning styles per se, but there has also been, in a same manner, no real empirical evidence to show that multiple intelligences is how Howard Gardner proposes them, even though it fits our intuitive notions. And the main problem with Howard Gardner's theory is that he says that there is no singular underlying factor of intelligence, but that intelligence can be parsimony into 8 different forms of intelligence, or what I call intelligentsia, different types of intelligence that exist in the mind, and more so, he does not give very good definitions for what these things are. And this is a consistent critique that you find in psychological literature, or when you talk to neuroscientists or cognitive scientists about the phenomena of multiple intelligences. And it is something that is widely accepted in educational theory because it fits the egalitarian model. But I dare people to go look at the scientific literature and see if you can find the same sort of confidence that any educator or teacher is going to have in the theory, because one is not intimate with the research and the other is intimate with the research and knows what we can say and what we cannot say by what has been gathered by quantification and comparison. And it goes such as this, that there was a group that tried to test Howard Gardner's theory in terms of ability, because that is a very serious problem insofar as this, that we need something, a theory in science, to have predictive capacity. So it needs to give us some sort of quantification that we can use and predict things with. It needs to help us get some numbers that we can compare things with. And when it is in the trait model, it has no real use as a scientific theory. It does have a use in a lay sense, or in a practical sense, if one wants to call it that, because I don't like that either. But I think it has a use in a lay sense in assuaging people's already intuitive notions that they are better at understanding some things versus understanding other things. I think that that's rather obvious, but necessarily doesn't have anything to do with intelligence as a general phenomenon, because most people have intelligence wrong in terms of what it is as a general phenomenon, and I've not been one to say that I have a strict definition for what it is, but in terms of what IQ tests do load for, in a sense, and what they do select for and measure, I do know very well what they're looking for and what other people typically think about the thing. They're not, people just don't know the evidence and don't know the research, and they don't do a very good job of separating themselves from the reasoning and the logic they do on the subject per se. And it's to say here that the only way that you can know if multiple intelligences would be a viable theory is to make some tight definitions for each intelligences, saying that they have certain factors that can be selected for, then making specific batteries for them analogous to classical intelligence IQ test, and then seeing what people score on those things and what correlation do they have to other batteries such as the Big Five and a traditional IQ test. And this experiment has been done and reproduced at least 4. I've read this type of paper by 4 different groups, so I can't say that it's been done 4 times. But somebody could probably do a meta-analysis in the field and see how many times a study of this variety has been done But I know very really that this has been done, and people, whenever they make these batteries for the multiple intelligence test, they find very really that one of the 5 traits from the Big 5 type indicator has correlation with if 2 or more intelligences. And what this implicates and what this means is that personality is influencing very really how people's aptitudes and tendencies for things are. What is most notable, though, however, is that the personality trait openness to experience had the greatest correlation with all of the multiple intelligences, excluding body kinesthetics and musical, and it is because researchers say that body kinesthetics and musical ability are not cognitive traits, but are more embodied traits that don't have to do necessarily with certain networks and modes of the brain as much as other intelligences that Gardner proposes. And interestingly enough, natural intelligence has a correlation with all 5 of the traits of the Big 5 model, and seems to be something that natural intelligence, if one scores highly on this intelligence, that they tend to score high on other intelligences, and that if one scores high on mathematical intelligences, that they tend to score high on the other logical intelligence, that they tend to score higher on the other intelligences. And this is a consistent pattern that even in people's personal reports of these questionnaires, when people tend to score high in one intelligence, they tend to score high in the other ones as well. And it's to say that when this test was done and these individuals were given general IQ tests, typically their general score on IQ matched how many different types of intelligences they scored highly on. It was very easy to see that if one scored high on IQ, that they would score high on more than one intelligence consistently, more than 5 a lot of times consistently. And the only thing it shows me and the only thing it tells me is there is a underlying intelligence that is pervading cognition, and it is because of this that when neuro imaging is done of people who score high on IQ, there is a consistent trait of them having very robust prefrontal cortexes with very thick cortical tissue, cortical structure, and white matter and gray matter tissue and fidelity in their brain. They have a tendency to have very strong frontal regions of the brain. And what the researchers proposed was that what one can note in any field per se, whether it be art, mathematics, physics, music, you name it, that there is for anyone who is exceptionally brilliant at it a tendency for reasoning. And it is to say that reasoning is the factor that people are selecting for more so than any one thing in an intelligence test. It's just that they're looking for the different ways that it can be made manifest. And that seems to be the general trend. And I will say this, that the multiple intelligences, whenever they're put on the same scale as an IQ test, they do not contribute to anything we didn't already know, per se, and they do not add to the picture of intelligence, but rather complicate the thing or completely disavow what we do know about the genetic and biological factors of intelligence. And we can go to people who have mental disabilities, and very really, when you look at somebody who is mentally disabled, there is always a genetic and physiological explanation for their mental deficiency, either missing genes, extra genes, prenatal damage, as in there was some sort of damage by way of alcohol poisoning or drug use or maladaptivity in some way, umbilical cords getting around the neck, a lack of oxygen to the brain or whatever that produces these mental disabilities in these individuals that tend to score 80s and downwards, 70 and below on IQ tests. And very really, the only other way you can find severe mental deficiencies in people, as this is a rarity in a sense, as just as much as profound intelligence, is metabolic disease or complete or very rampant and gross starvation at very critical years in development. So I do not know why people do not take the overall context of the question into account, insofar as that the question of intelligence fundamentally is one of a biological nature. And I do not see how, if we are evolved things, that there is not some sort of fixed underlying pervading pattern of cognitive schematization and ability that is the underlying buttress and makeup for what it is for an organism to take in and differentiate information within the environment. And that intelligence is not something that is merely an anthropological conception, maybe not even as much as knowledge, but is something that is so fundamental that you can find it in almost every organism, insofar as that there are very real patterns for decision making, and these patterns of decision making are really what people consider in terms of intelligence, because they have more to say about one's ability to reason. And it's to say this also, that the trait of fluid intelligence in working memory is also a testament to this, as the ability for strict associative thinking and categorical logic, essentially, or categorical reasoning, is very prominent in these two factors. Insofar as this, that an organism, when receiving information, has to make relevant or salient associations given the demands of the environment at the time. Creativity is another process, and why it's not necessarily associated with intelligence, and I do not consider it the same thing, and that there is this very real notion and factor within one having high IQ per se, or being highly intelligent, that anybody can see and observe in any field, independent of its conventions and practices, that intelligent people tend to systematize things. And I think that this is why there's a bias in a lot of people about the association of intelligence and certain personality types, to where intelligence only has a correlation with one trait in the Big Five model, and that is openness to experience, and personalities are a conglomeration of traits, and they can have their strengths and their differences and whatnot and what have you. The point is really that the aspect of reasoning is so prominent in any field, whether it is Michelangelo, Da Vinci, or Beethoven, or I think the obvious, or Picasso and Cubism. I don't know what you want to go with. You would say Newton or whomever, and I think that those are obvious and first-hand notions. But I will say that very really, in anyone that any great genius that has ever existed, or that somebody would consider a genius, does have a very strong